Anybody watching the recording, I've got to change the settings. You're gonna have to skip ahead about 10 minutes for class to actually start. It's just gonna record my chit chat with people. Hello, hi Elaine. If you're there. Like if Elaine or Edward are there, let me know. You guys joined early, so before I had opened up the Zoom, so I'm like, you might not actually be there right this second. Making sure everything's plugged in. Hi, good afternoon. You are okay. I'm just checking in. How are the two of you? Staying out of the heat, hopefully. Good, good. Yeah, I'm doing well over here. Um, Today's not my longest day. My longest is Thursday, so today's not too bad. And hello, hi Casey. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. And you?
Excellent, excellent. Yeah. Oh, I love. Okay, what is all in your background? Is it anime?
Yeah, it's Naruto.
Ah, okay. See, all right. Your generation is really into anime. I love it. I just have never gotten into it yet. But I
I
love
have a I have a 14-year-old. I'm actually 32, but I have a 14-year-old and he's about to be 15. He's the one that got me into Naruto.
ah. Well, you don't look 32. You're like, do not group me with the young ones.
Thank you.
You're like, I'm a millennial. Yeah, I'm like, I'm an older millennial. How old am I? I'm 36. Yeah, I'm like, I have to do the math. I'm like, I don't count anymore. uh Plus, and it might be the same thing for you. Once you hit a certain age, and especially with kids, like no, there's not the same kind of celebration around birthdays.
After 30, I never remember 30 what. I'm like, wait, or I say more or less. Wait.
Right, like I'm thinking maybe once I hit 40, that'll be the next benchmark, but for now I'm like, in fact, I was like, I'm 36. Can I just be mid 30s right now? Before I reach my late 30s. It's just aging is one of those weird things where like you don't feel older until something starts like, not feeling right. You don't really feel older, but get older. Hi, Kelly. I'm like, and we have a few, I think we have a couple of those of us in the millennial generation in the class. So that's always fun. So are you all staying out of the heat? Because it's gonna be hot this whole week. And I'm like, yesterday I took my dogs to the park, but today I didn't. And I feel like I need to be more good about that with them because they like their outdoor time. And um, it's not really safe to walk them in like the hot paving stones. Hello, hi Melanie. How's everybody doing? Most of you that just joined, hopefully well. Okay, I'm gonna ask again once more people are in here, but I need to ask those of you that are in here now. Was anybody at the library yesterday or whenever the issue happened? I'm like, I need to know what drama happened at the library the other day. No one has the cheese on it. I'm like, I need some good gossip. And I'm like, something had to have happened, right? You all got that email from the school saying the library north is closed, although we got another one earlier today, and I think it says it'll be back open tomorrow. So whatever the issue was, they must have fixed it quickly. But I'm like, I have a suspicion that maybe a small fire broke out somewhere. Nobody knows. I'm like, some of you like to use the library. You need to tell me what the gossip is. Okay, I'll ask again once we have more people in to see if anybody knows. So how was the weekend for all of you? Boring? Just work? Oh, you go to the other side of the library. Darn, okay. I better then I'll have to keep asking. I'm like, there's always somebody in the north side of the library. So I'm like, I wonder what happened. Or maybe it had something to do with either the cafe or every table. I'm like, someone knows. But all right. No one did anything fun over the weekend or anything interesting? I'm like, I didn't. That's why I asked you all. I'm like, hopefully someone did something fun. Your dog's birthday. How old is your dog now? I love dog birthdays. Oh, so a little puppy. I mean, my dogs are still puppies. Not really. They're like 8 and 9 years old, but call them puppies. I'm petting one of mine. They're both down underneath here. I'm seeing if either one of them want to come up. Want to come up? No. Okay. Stay down there. I love those of you who have been talking about your pets in the introduce yourself assignment. So far, I've got between the two classes, I've got people with bunnies, with hamsters, dogs and cats. I already knew that. I'm waiting to see if anybody has birds or any other kind of animal. Lots of pups and cats. And some of you are really creative with your pet names. I'm very jealous. Bella, you have a bird too. See, that's kind of cool. I always wanted to have lots of animals around. My mom would not have it though. We had dogs growing up, but they were both against my mom's wishes. Like my poor mom was like, no, let's not have pets. And somehow we still ended up with a couple of dogs. Hi, everyone. Hi, Adena. And let me see who else is in here. Hello. How's Tuesday on campus? Is it a busy day?
It's a pretty busy day, yeah.
I bet it'll start coming down. I mean, Tuesdays and Thursdays, I think, are always the busiest days on campus. But it comes down somewhere around week 3, week 4. Oh, well, yes, the MLK building, you're right. That building is always packed. So Casey, what you're telling me is that it's still extremely packed. Do most people on campus, like in classrooms and in the hallways, are people wearing masks? Or I don't remember. The elevators are always a pain. Yes, the elevators. Watch out the first time. Like, I should have warned you all. I once got trapped in an elevator in the first day of classes. I was trapped with a bunch of students with my food there. Like, my hands were full of things because I'd gone to get food. I was on my way back to my office, and all of a sudden the elevator just sticks in between floors. and it was fine. Like, we pressed the emergency thing, people came over, people were called, and I seriously, so I was like the only professor in the elevator, so I had to be like the calm one. So I was like, okay, don't freak out. There's instructions of what to do. A couple of students were in there and they were on their way to class and they were already late. And it was like one of those things where if you're stuck in the elevator, you're just going to be even more late. But at least the professor will understand. After that, I would only use the elevator when it wasn't packed. I'm like, I would just take the stairs. And that's actually how I figured out that my asthma needed to be under more control, because I couldn't make it all the way to the 4th floor without like trouble. And Brianna, well, I totally feel you. That once it happens once though, and you're forced to be calm through it, it's not as scary as it sounds. But yeah, oh my God, I never took that elevator when it was super busy ever again. I would only take it like in those periods when like nobody's on taking the elevator. Hi everyone. It's 4:30. I'm gonna give people like 30 more seconds to come in. But since more people are in now, I want to ask real quick. Does anybody know what happened at Library North? If they have to shut down the library to do fixes, I just have this feeling something happened, a small fire, something. And I'm waiting for someone who was there or who knows. Right? And the email, they say, oh, it's just small repairs. I'm like, but that's the university, right? They have to tell us that it's going to be closed and things. And they want to take care of legal liability issues. So they can't tell us that somebody screwed up. But I wonder. Yeah, they're reopening tomorrow in the morning. So anybody that uses to study can go back in. There was a lot of construction. Oh, see, they got on it really quick. They got on it really, really quick. Which is good. But that's what makes me think that something significant must have happened at the library. All right, none of you have the gossip. I'm gonna have to like go on campus or like email my colleagues and be like, who knows what happened here? But okay, let's start. Let's start with some announcements. The first thing is that I had been reading as everybody was submitting their introduce yourself assignments, because some of you were doing them before classes even started, but I've just now started grading them. So everybody in the class submitted there, so it'll be great. You will all be able to see your grades with a shining 100% A+, which is a great way to start. But this week we also have your first assignment, first bigger assignment. Melanie, I just see your message on there, so noted. Let me make sure I show you this, how it looks for you guys. Okay, so this week is your first discussion board post. So under week 2, remember that these modules have all the information you need. I was getting questions about this in my other class, so I want to make sure it's clear that all the readings are here. So you don't have to purchase the books. I know most of you are going with not purchasing it, which, okay, great. Then what you need to do is make sure that you go on to the Canvas course and do the reading. So like for today, you were supposed to have read chapter 2, which is this PDF, just the PDF. And at the end of the week, under write, we have a discussion board post. Now, it's not due right away. It's due Sunday by midnight. That way we can have class on Tuesday and Thursday where we talk about these questions, talk about the topics, and then it gives you some wiggle room to have time to complete them, but you can always go in and complete them early. In fact, 2 of your classmates are already working on these. So, so mostly if you already knew the Disney film Pocahontas, then you could answer some of these probably, or you could guess where we were going with this. You can also always go back and edit them, edit your answers, I think, or add to it. But this is the key, right? This is the key with the reading, is making sure that as you read, that you're answering the questions that you're supposed to, and not trying to memorized everything in the reading. And part of the issue with most textbooks and really most books period is that they give you more information that we can fit in our brain in one sitting, right? So I've picked out some of the things that I want to talk about and that kind of relate to the things I'll be talking about in class. So it's these topics, right? So again, not due till Sunday by midnight. When you all come in here though, to submit your response, you're gonna want to scroll down and hit reply, this button down here, right? And then you have this text box where you can just start on the text box and answer the question. You don't have to have the question because the question for me is right here, so I'll be able to see what you're answering. It's great if you label which question you're answering though. That makes it easier for me to grade. And the other thing, I think I mentioned this last week, but I want to reiterate that I've had people who were like working on their responses in the discussion board post, and then they accidentally hit refresh or backspace. Something happens to the computer, and then all the work is lost, and they've had to redo it. So I always say it's always a good idea to like pull up a Google Docs or a Word document and save it as you go, and then just copy and paste into this box, right? Once you have an answer, right, you hit post reply down here, and you'll be able to see everyone's replies. Once you submit your own response, for this discussion board post, I'm also going to ask you to comment on 2 other posts. You'll comment on the answers 2 of your classmates submit. Right now, I'm not grading the quality of your response. So there's not a minimum word count on how your responses are. So it can just sometimes be like, I agree with you. I like seeing more complete responses than that. But it all depends on like the questions and how everybody, how people respond to them. So I don't grade that. I just want you all to get to see each other's answers, because that is actually a really valuable tool, right? Sometimes we miss something in the reading or we miss something in the lecture. And when you see the way somebody put together information, it just like a light bulb goes off in your brain, right? And for that, we need to, like, that's the value of being in a class with 40 students, is that you can see how everybody's responding to them, how they put together, sometimes just how they even created those sentences and what their answer looks like. It gives you an idea of what works and what doesn't work when answering questions. And anybody that loses points on these, I will comment and let you know why privately. I usually, when I comment, I don't comment publicly. I will comment privately when I grade them, right? So for your answers, there's no word minimum again, but I do want to see as complete answers as possible. And for some of you, that may take 1 or 2 sentences, and some of you are more long-winded, as you'll see, and have more to say. And as long as you're answering the question completely, that's what I care about. Any questions about this first assignment? Someone's putting it in the chat. For each question, do we need to add examples to support from the reading and lecture? Amelia, that is always fantastic. It's the best way the best kind of writing has evidence to support it using examples from the reading. You don't necessarily need to quote the reading, but if you use examples from the reading, it helps a lot. Now, some questions will require, like I'll put in, give me some examples. Those are questions that I want examples from. Others, you might be able to answer without giving examples, but it's always a good idea if you have examples that fit to use them. Yeah, this is why also, like I sometimes see in the chat people asking if you should be taking notes. And the answer is always yes. Otherwise, if you didn't take good notes, what ends up happening is you're going to have to rewatch the recording of something you already sat through it, which is fine. But if you take good enough notes, then you don't need to do that. You don't need to watch the recording. Everything is already in your notes, and it's easier, faster. I'm like, I should have said that to the other class, so note to self. Okay. So today we're discussing the reading, and that's where I want to start. I'm like, I'm not going to commit the same mistake I did with my other class and ask you how many of you read it. But let's start with the reading, because there are some really interesting points here, because we start talking about the arrival of Europeans to the Americas, especially the arrival of the English to what is now the United States. And the reason we start there, even though there's an entire history beforehand, is because here we see the beginning of creating racial categories, right? These racial categories are not set in stone yet. They have not fully been created yet, globally or in the United States, but the beginning, the seeds of racial categories begin in some of these interactions between European and native people, right? Especially because the English, although they don't have yet a clear definition of whiteness, right? There's not a clear definition of whiteness. They definitely have a sense of superiority. They believe that they are better than other groups, right? Specifically, what other group does the reading talk about? The English believe they're, yeah?
The Irish people, and then also like the native people.
Yes. So this, and this is really important, right? Like, we're not going to go into the European history, but their history of contact with other people in Europe informs the way they look at native people. And so the Irish become very important in helping to give them a framework of how to think about native people. And what do the English think about the Irish in this time period, 1600s?
Like they're uncivilized.
Yes, if you look at some of these pages, let me go to like page 31. We go right here, right? In this page 31, the first full paragraph says, the first English colonizers in the New World found that the Indians reminded them of the Irish. Now, there really is a kind of weird comparison, but they're grabbing at something. They're grabbing at something to try to understand native people. And the thing that's striking them is down here in the last sentence of this paragraph, where he's Takaki, I always forget his last name. Initially, he says, savagery was defined in relationship to the Irish, and the Indians were incorporated into this definition. So what this tells us is that the English already come with this idea of what it means to be civilized, right? What it means to be so. Now they're going to add whiteness into that definition of civilized, but right now what they think is the English are civilized. That's the correct way of behaving and being. The Irish are the example of the incorrect way. This is how you behave if you are wild, savage, and untamed, right? And those words should sound familiar because those are the same words that they're going to use to describe native people, right? So it's not like they're coming up with a whole new language to talk about native people. I mean, they will add language to it, but initially they're using language that they've already been using against other groups, right? To identify them as inferior, in this case, the Irish, right? Now, the reading does talk about this, and I will, and I want to emphasize a little bit more on that point. But a lot of it also just has to do with the land, like with the land. And we're going to come back to that because land becomes an important way about how Europeans create ideas of native people. But for most of us, as we're thinking about this, right, as we're thinking about the English and other European groups coming to the Americas and imposing their ideas on new people, to what is to them new people, we have this kind of concept of this is what becomes the United States. Right? This is what becomes the country, the nation state we lived in. And I want to be very clear, right? This is going to come up several times during class throughout the semester, is that the idea of the United States, it's an idea. It's an idea with borders, with laws, political unit. So it exists, but it's also an idea. Right? And the reason that's important is because ideas change. Right? And in fact, this concept of the nation state is a brand new concept in history. Even today, it's really just a young idea, right? And you all know, actually, once you think about it, you know what existed before nation state, right? Can anybody give me one example of how people organize themselves into political units before nation states? What kind of political units did people use to organize themselves before nation states? Everyone's putting it in the chat. So tribes, yeah. So especially when we're talking about Native people, like they have actually very advanced ways, political units of organizing themselves. Absolutely. And before nation states, the dominant form of organizing political organization around the globe. So if you take really everywhere around the globe into consideration, was monarchies. Right? Monarchies came to dominate for a really long time. Right? Until the United States kind of breaks free of the English, and then the French decapitate their monarchies. Monarchies were like the most desired kind of political unit, right? That was done away. There are other ancient ways in which people organize themselves, right? And tribes is definitely one of the ways people organize themselves. After tribes and kind of smaller communities, you have empires, right? That's part of what the English are building, is a global empire, right? And coming to the Americas. But they were encountering empires in the Americas as well. There were these advanced political units. My emphasis there is this idea of the nation state is new. It has not always existed, so it can always be undone. It can always be undone. Right? And if anybody ends up going to graduate school, you're going to encounter a lot of theory, and especially this particular scholar. This idea of what the nation is, the definition of it, was basically defined by Benedict Anderson in his book, very famous book, Imagined Communities. And so if you're anyone that goes to grad school, you'll get to read more about him. But the quick summary of what he said that was so important was that he says a nation is an imagined political community, and that it is imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. And that's key, because just because something's an idea doesn't mean it's not real. It is real, right? We all have an idea of what the United States is, right? There's borders. Sometimes they're contested borders, but there's borders. So we imagine it as everything within these lines is the United States, right? And within these borders, then this government has authority. That's what it means to be sovereign, right? Like the UN can exist, right? It can set up laws, but it cannot come to the United States and tell the United States what to do or how to form laws. It just does not. Right? That's what it means to be sovereign, right? That people rule over themselves without outside interference. It's never that simple, but that's roughly the idea of this nation, or what it means to be a nation state, right? And to help us think about it, he says, Benedict Anderson says that it is imagined because the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them. Yet in the minds of each lives the image of their community. A lot of some fancy words that translated means we're never going to meet every American, right? We're just not. There's too many Americans. But we all have this idea of what it means to be American, and can acknowledge that every person, that a lot of people can fit within the definition of what it means to be American, right? Now, the tricky thing is that we don't always agree on what it means to be American, right? Like, what does it mean to be American? Let's dig into it. What would you say? right? I'm asking you. So it's like your grade dependent on you coming up with an answer of what it means to be American. What would you say? To live in America. Okay, Casey, that's a really great way to start, right? To live in America. Now, what? Oh, Pamela, we'll come back to that answer, to your answer. But Casey, so what? And for everyone, so what happens? Can somebody who lives outside of the United States be an American? Or do you automatically leave your Americanness when you leave the United States? Okay, so a couple of different things. One, it's like, okay, if you were born here, right? So one, if you were born in what we call the United States, then you definitely have rights of citizenship. You could leave the next day after you're born. Your parents could take you away, and you would still be an American citizen. But if you've never ever set foot in the United States again after the day you were born, can you still be American? Never set foot after the day you were born.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
How? How can you be American if you've never lived in more than a day in the United States?
Well, as long as you pay the taxes, you'll be American.
Ah, but for that, you actually either have to live or have businesses. So it is possible for someone to never pay taxes, have been born in the United States, right, to not consider themselves American. On the other hand, it is possible to have been born in the US and spend a limited time in the US and still be American, right? There are people that, like if your family's in the military and you travel around a lot, right? You can still be American and just haven't had to spend a lot of physical time in the United States, right? Then there's the complication of we people that live in the United States like to call ourselves American, but that word America is much more complex because the whole continent is the Americas. So technically that term better applies to anybody from any part of North or South America or Central America. But we do tend to use it as, like, at least in the US, as this to be part of our identity. It is to be in the United States. Okay, Edward brings up a really interesting point. Culturally, you can be different, but still have American roots. Okay, so it's these roots then, right? Because legally, as Casey pointed out, legally, if you were born in the US, that's citizenship right away. It doesn't matter how much time you spend in the US, having been born here, the Constitution says makes you an American citizen. But that's different than American roots and culture. That can be quite different. Someone put in the chat, well, it's like being Mexican but born in the US. Are you still Mexican even though you're American? And that is why we come up with these hybrid identities, right? Like I've decided that a hybrid identity that best fits my sense of self, right? So I call myself Mexican American, right? And this is actually something quite unique in the United States. It's starting to become more popular outside of the United States, but here, most places around the world didn't have this idea that you could have a mixed kind of national identity like that, where it's hybrid. Let's come back though to, somebody had mentioned higher education, right? How is higher education a part of what it means to be American? Because there are other countries have higher education, there are universities all over the world, but it can be something that is critical to understanding Americanness. It could be.
I don't think that's true, but
Well, that's why I'm asking. But if we're going to include it in some sort of definition to it, for some people it is, right? Some people come to the U.S. specifically for education, right? Because they see it as more accessible here. Yeah, I think that actually totally depends. It totally depends because people around the world sometimes have better access to education, cheaper access to education. But that doesn't mean that in every place there's the same kind of open access to education. I know for like my parents, that was a key part of what they thought their children were going to benefit from coming to the United States, that their children were going to benefit for a better access to education. Right? That's what my parents thought coming to the United States would be about. Right? Somebody else put in the chat, I think that it's part of the American dream. Yes. Now, this idea of the American dream has become really important to like the way Americans like to define themselves. Right now, a lot of parts of the American dream are just that, a dream, an ideal. They don't become true for everybody, but this idea of that you can come and regardless of your economic background, regardless of your race and ethnicity, regardless of your religion, anyone can achieve prosperity, financial prosperity. Anybody can own a home and have a stable financial life. That's part of how we define the American dream. I'm saying part of how we define the American dream. In reality, how real is that? You guys can tell me.
Very hard to obtain, especially if you're not a rich white man.
And that's the struggle for a lot of immigrant communities, as we'll see, right? Something brings people to this country, has brought people to this country over the course of hundreds of years. And then for most immigrant communities, there's a period of shock at facing the reality of what it means to be an immigrant in the United States, right? So as Kelly says, it's just an ideal of what it means to be successful. Right? And everybody puts in their own idea of what that means, right? What it means to be successful. For some people, it's about money. And so they put that idea into their definition of the American dream. For other people, it's not. It's not about money. It might be more about family. Right? Janine says, it sets up a standard of successful living in America, which can be detrimental for communities who are especially marginalized. Yes. Yes. So, okay, let's come up with our definition then. We can talk about all the things that are not part of being American or all the difficulties in it. But if we as a class come up with a definition of what it means to be American, what would we say does it mean to be American? I know it's tricky, but somebody's got to say something. What does it mean to you then to be American? Okay, Omar. So here, start us off. It's a kind of cultural identity, and it is. Are we going to put freedom? Let's see. Let me take a poll. Raise your hand if we should put freedom in our definition of what it means to be American. Okay. So interesting. We don't have an agreement. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I don't know. It's not even half the class that is saying we should put freedom. So in that sense, there's already a core disagreement there. Why is freedom not something we can agree on? Isn't it a good thing, freedom? Do you all feel free?
I feel like freedom is not really something that we really get here.
Okay.
Coming from a Hispanic background, I mean, we had to give up a lot of stuff, pay a lot of stuff and get that freedom. Not everybody just automatically gets that freedom here.
Okay.
So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Historically, and Janine is bringing up a great point. Historically speaking, there has not been, for most of this country's history, not everyone has had access to freedom in any way you define it, right? We can't because slavery existed from the very beginning. Right? You can only talk about it having ended at the end of the Civil War. So that's one of the complications with the word freedom. But if we did a poll of every American, every person who self-identifies as American in the United States and around the world, they would probably include the word freedom in their definition. Right? Now, what each person defines freedom as would be different. For some, it would be political rights. Right? For some people, it would be like freedom of speech, freedom to practice whatever religion is. And all of those are complex ideas, but people bring it. So Sebastian and Brian, are your hands up because you want to add something right now, or are they up from having raised it for freedom? Oh, freedom has left the building. Okay. Okay, so we're gonna not add freedom to our definition of what it means to be American. So, okay, let's think about it a different way. Let's think about it from very personal definitions, right? For example, for most of my life, growing up in California, like I like to say, I grew up in Pete Wilson's California. And Pete Wilson's California for an immigrant girl was kind of hard. This was the time in which California passed a law, Prop 187, which said that people who were not citizens, residents of the United States would not have access to public education or public services, any public services, right? So for me, it was what I was being told, or what I felt I was being told by California at this time, was that I was not American enough to be deserving of an education, to be deserving of medical care, to be deserving of anything. That was not American. That was kind of hard as a kid to see that happening in the place I lived in. But then later on, when I was in college, I went to Europe. I went to France, and I have to tell you, I have never felt more American than when I've been in France. Like my Americanness, and having spent a lifetime at that point, almost my entire life in the United States, just screamed, "You're very American." One of the ladies that I lived with when I lived in France, she would take me around to her neighbors and introduce me as her American friend. And what are the things that made me feel American in France? One, the expectation of customer service. The way we think of as customer service, good customer service in the US is very different than the expectations around the globe. Definitely very different than the expectations in France, right? Tipping was another thing that like screamed at me, "You're American," because I felt like I needed to tip everywhere, and no, people don't live off of tips in places like France. I mean, they'll like them, they'll take your money, but it's not an expectation, right? So let me ask you all then, what are the things that have made you feel the most American? When you're like, yeah, in that moment, I felt American.
I think for me, it's just being born here, just because I was the only one born here from my family.
Yeah.
Since I have a sister and my two parents, they came here, and luckily I didn't have to struggle with getting my citizenship or green card or anything like that. So I had already an advantage from them just because I was born here. So for me, like, person being American is just being lucky enough to be born here.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, that's it.
And that's why it's so important for a lot of people, right? Why a lot of people say citizenship first and foremost, because you've been around what it means when you don't have that kind of legal protection, right? And so that right of citizenship becomes really important then to being American. Other things that you're all saying in the chat: burgers feel very American. McDonald's, oh my God. I try to avoid typical American foods abroad because, like, you're abroad, I want to experience a different culture. But I've walked into McDonald's when I've really been homesick abroad. You walk into McDonald's and it almost feels like home. They have very different menus than McDonald's around the world, but it does feel like Starbucks. Oh, Starbucks can also be very fulfilling when you're homesick. Wearing the uniform. So, Jose, are we talking about military uniform? Because that'll do it. The clothes that people wear. Yes, when I first went to Europe, people told me, don't wear jeans. If you wear jeans, everybody will know you're American because most people don't wear jeans. That's less the case now. Jeans are popular all over the world, and American fashion has like come to dominate so much of the global economy. But there's things like that, yeah. Tipping, different tipping systems. Some of you are bringing up, yep. Hot dogs or corn dogs. Yeah, I mean, other cultures have all kinds of other weird food that are, I think you can correlate to hot dogs and corn dogs, but it is one of those things that feels very American. Filipino McDonald's serves rice, really? I mean, not entirely surprising, but I'm like, that's cool. Processed food. And the size of food, by the way, one of the things that always shocks me the most when I've traveled abroad and I come back is how big portions are when you eat out here. Huge. No ranking systems in the American education system. The way our education system works is quite different. Yeah. Wearing pajamas outside the house. Yes, actually, you could not get away with wearing sweats to your university classes in other places. That would be super weird and you'd be like laughed at. That is very American. And I've had students studying abroad in the US who come to class and they're a little bit shocked at what they see. Especially in California, by the way. We're so casual in California. Oh, really? Okay, Janine's giving us some important information below, but I want to make sure that I didn't skip anything else somebody said up above in the chat. Yes, and we'll totally do some work deconstructing the word freedom, Emily. But so I did notice your chat. American lifestyles, ways of being, things like capitalism, etc., our suspicion of anything that gets called socialist or communist. Other places around the world are not so suspicious of socialism or capitalism the way people tend to be here in the United States. Like for something to be called socialist or communist, somehow still is like that gets used as a political tool in the US. I think there's less of that for Gen Zers, for those of you younger folk. But even during my generation, I'm like, that was still something that was like a big deal. Wearing shoes inside the house. Some of you see now, you're all coming out with all of your Americanness, right? And they vary, right? Some of these cultural norms within the United States, they vary, but we attach these meanings to the idea of what it means to be American. And we disagree with each other. Yeah, what it means to be American to me doesn't always, will not always match up with what your definitions of it is. I don't, that democracy, that's another complex one. We can spend like the entire semester talking about that, but we'll come back to that, to deconstructing the idea of democracy and how we associate it with Americanness, because that will definitely come up. So okay, let's get back to how these ideas get created, right? Because ultimately the United States exists in our minds as an idea, as a reality, and it comes with particular consequences. But as the nation state is going to develop, as we create this idea of the United States, with it comes nationalism. And the very simple definition of nationalism is the belief that a particular nation and its culture, people, and values are superior to other nations. So once we create nation states, we create nationalism as well. Is nationalism a good thing or a bad thing? I love asking that question because you all can tell me. Is nationalism a good thing or a bad thing? Not good, a bad thing. Can
Bad
nationalism,
thing. Yeah.
yeah, Mustafa?
Hmm.
No, say that again.
I said it's pretty bad thing.
Pretty bad thing. What can it ever be a good thing? For example, at the Olympics, can nationalism be a good thing at the Olympics?
I don't know. I think like if you feel like pride about where you come from and your background, I think that's good and like super awesome and beautiful. But I think it becomes a problem when there's superiority and then also like discrimination against other people.
Yeah. And this is the tricky thing about any kind of nationalism. And by the way, we could debate that. We could debate just the idea of like, is nationalism good or bad for a long time because there are definitely, I mean, inherent in the definition of nationalism is believing that your culture is better, that your values are better than all others. But then there are things like the Olympic where it doesn't feel so bad. It doesn't, it seems to bring people together. And that's a key idea within nationalism and the idea of the nation state. It's a way of defining group of people. But when you define who belongs into any group, you are also defining who doesn't belong. So it becomes very important who is being left out of this definition of what it means to be American, right? Because that is always happening, right? And it can have some very negative consequences. Depending on who you're leaving out, right? So that is what we will be analyzing the whole semester, how race and ethnicity becomes entangled with who gets to be part of the nation and who does not. Right? So, okay, right away, the Europeans arrive in what we now call the United States. And we're still privileging them even as we criticize them. So I want to acknowledge that. But they're right away, the way they view the land, so not even getting to the people yet, the way they view the land, like the physical land, the mountains, the trees, the bodies of water, the way they view all of that, the environment and the land, is hugely important in the way they're going to view people. And so those of you who did the reading know, how do the English that arrive in Virginia, for example, how do they view the land?
They were like acting like it's their God-given right to be there. Sorry, that was low-key kind of savage, but they really were like doing way too much. And they're like, this is ours, like this is a land of abundance, blah, 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 blah. And they get all mad that like, there's people already living there.
Absolutely. Yes. And this is the origins of the ideas like manifest destiny. They're deeply entwined with what people think of the land because they view it as like abundance of natural resource. And that's really important because for these Europeans arriving in the Americas, the countries they're coming from in Europe have been just decimated. They have ecologically devastated their countries. Places like England had run out of things like wood, and they needed wood for like everything. So they run out. So when they arrive in the Americas and they see these huge forests, right? Trees everywhere, they think, mine. I need these. These are things we don't have an abundance of. We have very limited quantities back home. And look at this, trees everywhere. And they view it as untouched. Look at all these mountains. Nobody's dug tunnels through them. They haven't built roads through them. And they view it as a pristine wilderness. They see all these natural resources and they think it's untouched and free for the taking. Were they right? Jose? Yeah.
Yeah, they thought that the natives were foolish for not taking advantage of the land, so they said, well, it must be for us since they didn't do anything with it.
That's
So they,
exactly it. Mhm.
and they didn't consider anything about the respect that the natives had for their own land.
Yes, like they were wrong. They're very clearly, it's not like they don't see people, they see people. They're encountering people as they see this land and these natural resources, but they see it as untouched because they don't see the same kind of development that they see back home. Right? They don't see the same kind of abuse of natural resources that they see at home, so they see it as untouched. But they know that there are people there. They're coming into contact with these people, right? But then they moralize it. They make it a moral issue, right? That it is, and they do say that it is their God-given right, right? They add God to it and they say, aha, God has gifted us this new continent because we don't have enough resources over there. So God has gifted us this land. Clearly, in their mind, the native population has not used this land properly. They're not using enough of it. They haven't developed it, they think. Therefore, it's ours. Right? And it's these jumps in logic, right? They're making logical jumps that we can look back and criticize because we know at one, not only were Native people there, but they were using the land. This is not an untouched wilderness. It is not. It has been touched. It has been developed. There were roads. There were villages and towns. I mean, there were cities in the Americas. Right? There are trade networks all over the place. It just didn't look the same. And because it doesn't look the same, then they think it's theirs. Now we are dealing with climate change. Yeah, and the thing I'm emphasizing here in terms of like, hey, Native people were using the land. They had a very different relationship with the land, but we don't want to romanticize it either. We don't want to say they were not, like they were using the land properly. Well, that properly is kind of not a good word to bring into account because they had a very different relationship with the land. It was more sustainable relationship with the land. But Native people in the Americas had domesticated animals, so they had specifically chosen certain animals to populate. Some species of animals and plants had gone extinct already because of the decisions that Native populations had made, but their practices were more sustainable than European practices were. So we want to make sure here that we're careful, right? That we talk about Native people as existing and using things, and acknowledge though that the way they were using things was different than the way the Europeans wanted to use it and end up using it. Oh yeah, and we'll get to industrialization and domestication. Yeah, very important in the way that the reading talks about this here. And by the way, it's really important because we often forget about it. That Native people, it wasn't like, it's not like they were out in the forest, like just like communing with nature, right? Like we have this idea of Native people that's very romanticized at times, but they had made significant technological advances and like ideological advances, right? Like one of the things we can look at Native people in the Americas and look at their advanced farming techniques, hugely advanced farming techniques and diverse. Different groups of indigenous populations all over the Americas had different ways of farming. They used whatever was around them. For some groups, it was like growing things in islands on lakes so that you could have better access to water. Like that's how they solved the irrigation problem. Others had made all kinds of different like canals and different kind of irrigation early kinds of irrigation in order to allow for the kind of farming that they were doing. Right? They were growing species that were unknown in other parts of the world. So these techniques were extremely advanced, right? Their mathematical concepts, in some cases, were even more advanced than other populations, right? Native populations had the concept of zero, for example, and these are things that anthropologists look at when they're looking at groups of people to see how advanced are they, right? How along. They were building empires and trade networks and all of these things. So it was advanced groups of people that the Europeans are meeting, but they're dismissing it all, right? They're dismissing it all as they're coming into contact with it because it's different. And so this is where we can make the connection. They're seeing the land and the environment as pristine wilderness, right? And that then is some of the same language that they then apply to talk about Native people, right? They talk about Native people like they are some sort of empty vessels that they can fill in with their ideas. This becomes really important for the Catholic Church, for example, right? Because the Catholic Church undergoes a missionary and project to bring Catholicism to Native populations all over the Americas, right? Because they think that's the only way to be a good, proper person is to convert to Catholicism. Right? Okay, let's get a little more specific, right? We're talking about the eastern part of American history. Then the meeting of peoples that is happening is the English are coming into contact with the Powhatans, right? And here's a map that John Smith drew in 1606. He drew this map. It is one of the first recorded maps of this part of Virginia, right? It's a European map of Virginia, though, right? So let's look at this very European map of what is now Virginia. What jumps out at you? What was John Smith adding to his map? What's that? Got things in there, right? He's got bodies of water, right? He's telling us where the bodies of water are. What else? It's not a trick question. Okay, we'll come back. He is acknowledging the existence of people here, right? The Powhatan, he puts an image here in this corner where he acknowledges that there are people that live in this and what he's calling Virginia, right? But is he making it clear that there are people all over the place? Where else can we see that there are indigenous people in this map? Can you find evidence of indigenous people anywhere else in his map? Probably
I mean,
not.
can't really
Yeah.
see it, because I'm low-key blind, but he like kind of labels it, right?
Yeah.
It'll say the areas of like certain tribes, it looks like.
There are, you see, yeah, but they're words, right? The only people he actually shows is over here and then this human figure here. Right? Otherwise, what is he showing us primarily in this map? What are these things in different shades?
Resources and trees.
Yeah, like really basically he's showing us trees. Is this an 100% accurate? Like if he draws one tree, is it because there's one tree right there?
No, is it to show like an abundance of resources that they could basically take?
Yeah, like the English are noticing the darn trees because there's a very limited quantity of these in England at this point, right? The forest in England have been completely just over forested. So if the English notice all the trees, so everywhere he's putting tree is to signal like there is wildlife here. There's vegetation, there's forest everywhere. Look at all the trees he puts all over the place, right? So yeah, and what he's noticing is resources. So trees are very important then. Bodies of water are huge. right? There's a reason why, as the Europeans arrive in different parts of the Americas, they're settling around bodies of water. They make agriculture easier. They make transportation easier. They make travel easier. They make so many things easier. It's why actually they are encountering people around bodies of water, because Native people have the same idea. Bodies of water make things easier. So he's noting that also, those kinds of resources. What are these other little bumps here? In between trees, you see other little bumps. What do you think those are? Bump. That's clearly not a tree. He likes to draw trees with these little pikes here. What are these things? Mountains or hills? Potentially, yes. We're thinking these are smaller, smaller ones, because he's not drawing bigger ones. But yeah, they're probably here some sort of barriers, natural kind of barriers that exist in land, and those will also be important to know where they're located as people begin moving inland more and more. Yeah. Now, okay, let's go to his one depiction of Native people over here in this corner, right? The Powhatan, he's labeled it, right? What can anybody see? Kind of see? I know it's not a great image of it, and also it's a weird sketch. But what can you make out in this corner over here? How is he depicting the Powhatans? You see, where did my cursor go? You see one figure sitting in some sort of structure in the background, right? You can't always tell where he's drawing people, except in the kind of more in the foreground area. You can kind of tell that these are bodies, right? That these are people. So you can see a figure here, potentially another figure over here, and the one that's central. This looks like another figure because there's like kind of hands and feet. This one potentially as well. What's happening in the scene, do you think? What did he draw there? This is not a trick question. I'm genuinely asking, what is he drawing there? How can we interpret what he's drawing there? Looks like there's one ruler or king in the tribe. Yeah, there's some sort of leadership here, right? Yeah, that this would be a kind of depiction of that. Maybe, oh, okay, now we're getting into interpretation, but potentially worshiping of one individual, maybe. Part of the problem is like, why isn't he like, what is all this blob in the middle? It's hard to tell, right? But okay. What can we say about John Smith and the English based just on this map of what they're calling Virginia? What kind of people are these Europeans? What kind of person is John Smith? He's a pirate. That's not too far from what he is. He saw himself as this kind of adventurer, right? He saw himself as an adventurer. So he's very interested in like this kind of wilderness, this kind of land, and like, conquering it as kind of explorer. He very much saw himself as a kind of explorer. He cares about natural resources, right? And he knows that anybody looking at his map cares about that, right? So he's gonna put that in his map of this land. He's also, isn't he taking possession of this land too? Like there's a name. All these rivers had names. He knows this. He is in contact with the Powhatan. He's in contact with them. He knows there are names for these rivers, that there's a name they've given this land. But he's coming in conquering. Yeah, he's like, forget the names that already exist for these places. This is now the Virginian Sea. right? This is now Virginia. So we can tell that there's like already from the very beginning that these Europeans are coming in with the intent of taking possession here. There's already a premeditated plan of what's going to happen here. So the reason I'm emphasizing that is because even in the maps, we can see the politics of what's going on. Right? We can see the politics that the English come in just in some basic things like how they draw the maps, what they put in their maps, who and what they acknowledge as having an existence, and how important they view that. Right? The Powhatan, John Smith is acknowledging the existence of this group of indigenous people here, but how important are they to him, do you think? We're guessing. We haven't read any of John Smith's papers.
Probably not important at all because he's clearly putting resources over the lives of people and communicating that message to the people back home.
Yeah, this is not an apolitical map, right? There's a clear message he's putting in a message that is going to go to people viewing this map, and the audience is clearly back home. Yeah, conquering in a sense, in the renaming of rivers. Yes, the renaming everything that becomes very important to the Europeans. Renaming everything, and using their monarchs to name everything here. Right now, most of us actually do know a little bit more about the Powhatan. We know it through one of their most well-known figures, right? If you've watched the Disney movie, you know her as Pocahontas. Her indigenous name was Matoaka. What do you know about Matoaka? Or what do you know about Pocahontas? Yeah, her father was chief at the time. It was a matrilineal kind of society, but at the time her father was the chief. Yeah, so she was kind of royalty. She was very young. Yeah, she was very young when she comes into contact with the English. Yeah. Lewis and Clark. Oh, Stephanie, almost. We'll come back to Lewis and Clark. So we're not at Lewis and Clark yet. But how does Disney, what story does Disney give us about Pocahontas?
Like the love story between her and John Smith. John Smith, is that his name?
Yeah.
No,
yeah. It is all about the romance, the whole story. Like it's about the clash of cultures and these two individuals, each from these different cultures, like coming together, overcoming everything that's meant to keep them apart and falling in love. Disney did a lot of that. Like if you look at their early films, there's always a romantic love story in Disney films. Have you noticed that lately there's not as much? It's more about family. Most of the more recent animated Disney films. But yes, the film definitely leaves out a lot of the violence, but it's also like just incredibly incorrect, right? And we know Disney lies to us, but really, Disney really lied to us with the story of Pocahontas. We don't have any evidence that she was ever in any kind of romantic relationship with John Smith. Has anybody ever watched Pocahontas 2?
I'm sad to say that I have.
I know it's not as many people saw Pocahontas 2. They try to correct the whole John Smith thing because they have to show her like marrying the man she actually marries in real life. But yeah, I'm like it's not the best movie in the world. She did actually have two husbands during her lifetime. Her first husband was an indigenous man, Kocoum. His depiction in the movie is also terrible, but she is married to him in her life, and then he dies, and she marries an Englishman, John Rolfe. He's a wealthy Englishman. we don't, she's one of the few indigenous women we actually have more evidence of her life, but we have a very limited understanding of her life. Based on the sources, we know that she was kidnapped in 1613 by the English. And she's kidnapped. And this is after, skirmishes and wars between the Powhatan and the English that are arriving. Then we don't know exactly how this happened because there are not a lot of sources on it. And most of what we have was written by the English. But we know that in 1616, she was hired by the Virginia Company of London. But even saying hired is tricky. She got paid for promoting, going to England. She went to London and she would promote people going to the Americas. So she gets used as a propaganda tool by the English to try to send more English people to what is now Virginia. But since she was kidnapped in 1613, we don't know if this is a decision she makes freely to work with the Virginia Company of London, or if it was a forced kind of decision she has to choose, right? So we think so, yeah, Janine. Then, I've moved too far. We also know that she dies. She dies in England, in very shortly after her arrival in England. In 1617, we know she died in Gravesend, England. She had two, I believe she has a couple of children with John Rolfe. But we know how she gets used by the English, right? So can we trust what the English say about her? If I'm telling you, most of the sources we have are written by the English. Can we trust them? Hello, you're saying in the chat, nope. Why can't we trust what the English say about her?
They've proven to have like a racist track record on the way that they depict anyone other than themselves.
Yes, and this is a huge problem with dealing with any of the European sources for this time period in which they're arriving in the Americas, is that they're extremely biased, they're extremely racist, sexist too, right? And they also have their own political goals. Yes, Casey's pointing out in the chat, right? They're making their own stories about her to fit what they need, right? And the Virginia Company of London is trying to get people to come to the Americas, right? They're making money off of bringing English settlers to what is now Virginia. So they're going to present her how they want. In fact, the only known portrait we have of her is this sketch that was made of her in England. What do you think of this sketch made of her? It's like they've taken everything, all of her native identity, and they've just taken it away. There's not a lot of hints of that. Yes. Instead, what does she look like?
I mean, she looks like an old white lady.
She's meant to look like a proper English woman, like a proper English lady. Yeah, like a European, in European clothes, with the hat and the feather and, that really high neck thing that was very popular in the Elizabethan era. So we can't trust that image, right? We can't trust that image. We can't trust most of what they say. In fact, usually we can actually trust that the exact opposite of what they're saying is happening. That's usually how we can try to piece together the lives of these individuals. Now, we do have things written about her from Native people. We have Native sources from the Powhatan writing about her. Right? She didn't live long, and we can only imagine everything she went through, right? But we do have some Native sources about her, I'm saying, right? So how much can we trust what, and let me say, everything that's written about her by the English are all Englishmen writing about her. Everything we have about her written from native sources are also all men. So if you were reading it, if I were assigning you to read native sources on her, on Matoaka, how much would you trust them?
I'd say like definitely like a little bit more since it's like from the same culture, but also you have to consider like she's a woman as well, and there's still like sexist ideals even within that culture too.
Yes, and they also have their own motives for how they're talking about her. Right? So we can't fully trust either like group of sources, right? Everybody's have some agenda when they're writing about her. Some of the people that were writing about her never met her, never talked to her, like they were not friends with her. So we can't always like give them too much weight, right? We can't give them too much weight. We have absolutely nothing written by her. We have her signature in a couple places, but the signature can only tell us so much. Sometimes we can glean a lot from that, but in this case, we have nothing written from her point of view. We don't have her version of any of these events. Right? And as it is, we have kind of limited understanding of what happens in her life, but we have nothing from her point of view. And this is very typical of the kinds of sources or lack of sources that we have for Indigenous women. We often have very little on them, most of them written by European men, almost nothing from an Indigenous perspective. And when it is, it's also from sources that are not 100% trustworthy either, right? So for example, Lewis and Clark, sorry, the story of Lewis and Clark is that they come, right? They help connect, explore all the way to the West Coast, and with the help of an Indigenous woman, Sacagawea. Almost everything we know about Sacagawea, this very famous Indigenous woman, probably the second most well-known Indigenous woman in the United States. Everything was written by Lewis and Clark. So we don't know much about her from her point of view. And this is true all over the Americas. If you know some Mexican history, you might know who La Malinche is. Another really famous Indigenous woman in Mexican mythology. And again, we have nothing from her point of view. And she was really used and misused by like everybody. So it becomes a huge problem in the way we try to piece together the lives of these people. We still try, right? Historians still try. They try to use the help of anthropologists and try to read in between the lines and what was actually written, but it becomes very difficult to actually piece together those lives. So I don't have time to play you any clip from the movie, so I'll come back to that on Thursday, because we want to examine how Disney uses this story, because it's Disney's the one that puts the story of Pocahontas kind of on the map, right? It's what makes her known for most of the population. Most people are not going to go and search Virginian history or read those sources. We're going to learn what we get from movies. That's how most of us learn history, is from movies. So I want to show just a little clip of that. Also because it was a big deal at the time. Like I was a kid when Pocahontas came out, and I remember being like, oh my goodness, a non-white princess, yay. And I loved the movie, right? It was my favorite movie that Disney put out, and like I loved it. But now I look back at it, when I watch it now, and I'm like, problematic. There's all kinds of problems all over Pocahontas. So we're going to dissect one of the songs and see how Disney tried. Like they tried. And at the time of the release of the movie, it was a big deal. It was to have a non-white princess. Right? It was a big deal, but they got so much wrong that we gotta discuss it. Yeah. So we'll come back and then we'll make sure that you have answers to all of the discussion board questions. That's the benefit of coming to class on Thursday. I will give you the answer. We will discuss the answers. I shouldn't say I will give you. We will discuss the answers to every single one of those questions. Sound good? You already have some of them. I think a lot of you can now actually finish doing the discussion board question. But if anybody still has doubts, we will make sure that everybody can answer those questions on Thursday. So, okay, you're free to go. If anybody has questions or comments or wants to add anything though. Yeah, okay. Have a good day.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Don't go telling your friends that I told you freedom is not American though. I'm like, don't send people after me.
They already know.
Good, good. If they already know, good. 'Cause I'm like, we'll talk about that. But as you can tell, even within the class, it was a little bit like, ooh, controversial. Questions? Emily or Sierra, if you have questions or need to talk to me, let me know. You can let me know in the chat if you can't turn on your mic. All right, I'll sign off.